Denver, Colorado, July 18, 1878. On July 18, 1878, the overnight minimum temperature in Denver held near 70 degrees Fahrenheit, an unusually warm low for the Front Range. 3 weeks later, the city recorded 105 degrees Fahrenheit, the highest temperature then observed in local records. Nights stopped cooling cabins. Roof boards radiated stored heat past midnight. Bedding absorbed it. Most homestead cabins in the region were built for winter, single-wall log shells, tight chinking, low ceilings, minimal openings. Those choices conserved fuel in January, but in July they trapped heat where people slept. Loft spaces became unusable during prolonged heat. One homesteader altered nothing structural. He did not cut a new window or add a vent tower. He opened a small floor grill beneath an existing stovepipe, left the pipe exposed to sun, and allowed heat to move the way it always does, up. By August, the loft was occupied again. His notes recorded a single outcome: no more sweat on pillows. The question was not comfort, it was whether directed airflow could outwork brute insulation. South Platte Basin Homestead, outskirts of Denver, July 18, 1878. The roof boards were warm to the hand 2 hours after sunset. This was not unusual for a frontier cabin. What made it significant was that the warmth persisted past midnight, radiating downward into the loft space where 2 adolescent boys had moved their bedding for the summer. By dawn, their pillowcases showed dampness. The heat had nowhere to go. The cabin was not poorly built. It followed standard homestead practice for the region. Logs 8 to 10 inches in diameter, stripped of bark, chinked with clay mixed with sand and horsehair. The walls were single thickness. The roof was planked with split pine, covered with tar paper and a thin layer of sod. The structure measured 16 feet by 20 feet, with a loft tucked beneath the pitched roof for additional sleeping space. Every construction choice had been made to conserve heat. The chinking was thorough, eliminating drafts. The ceiling was kept low, just 7 feet at the eaves, to reduce the volume of air that needed warming. The single window on the south wall was small, no more than 2 feet square, shuttered with a hinged plank. The door fit snugly in its frame. These features were deliberate. Frontier building manuals and settlement guides from the 1860s and 70s emphasized tight construction. Winter fuel scarcity drove every decision. A cord of firewood represented days of labor, cutting, splitting, hauling. A cabin that held heat required less wood. Less wood meant more time for other work. The same envelope that saved fuel in January created a thermal trap in July. Heat from the day's sun soaked into roof boards, log walls, and the earth beneath. As exterior temperatures dropped after sunset, the stored heat radiated inward. In a tight cabin with no high exhaust path, that heat accumulated in the highest point, the loft. Hot air rises. This principle was understood, but its implications for summer livability were rarely addressed in construction guidance. Most manuals focused on winter survival. Summer discomfort was expected, even accepted. People adapted by sleeping outdoors, relocating bedding to cooler ground-level spaces, or simply enduring. The homesteader whose cabin this was had tried those adaptations. The boys had slept outside for a week in early July until mosquitoes and a nighttime dust storm made that untenable. They moved bedding downstairs near the door, but the single-room layout made privacy and household function difficult. The loft offered separation when it was usable. On the morning of July 18th, the homesteader recorded in a small leather-bound ledger, "Loft boards warm at dawn, boys bedding damp, night air failed to clear heat." The observation was precise. The problem was measurable. The solution would require understanding not what to build, but how to make existing structure work differently. The cabin did not need thicker walls. It needed a pathway for heat to leave. Denver Signal Service Station, 1870 to 1878. Weather on the American frontier had long been understood through experience and folk prediction. A red sky at morning, the behavior of livestock, the feel of air pressure before a storm, these were the tools of agricultural planning. But by the late 1860s, a more systematic approach was taking hold. In November 1870, the United States Army Signal Service inaugurated a coordinated weather observation network. Stations were established at military posts, railway depots, and telegraph offices across Western territories. Observers took readings at fixed hours, 7 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, 9 in the evening, and transmitted data by telegraph to regional centers. Denver established a signal service station in 1872. Observations were recorded in standardized logbooks: temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction and velocity, cloud cover, precipitation. The data accumulated. Patterns emerged. For homesteaders, the practical value was not in daily forecasts, those remained unreliable, but in understanding extremes. The record showed not just how hot a summer afternoon might become, but how warm the night stayed. This second number mattered more for interior comfort. A cabin could shed daytime heat if nighttime air dropped sufficiently. Even a tightly built structure would cool gradually as exterior temperatures fell into the 50s or lower. But when overnight lows remained in the 60s or above, the cabin retained heat. The following day's sun added more. The cycle compounded. The summer of 1878 brought extended stretches of warm nights. The Signal Service logs documented it. Precisely. From July 15th through August 10th, Denver recorded only 3 nights where the temperature dropped below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Most nights held in the mid to upper 60s. 2 nights in late July stayed above 70 degrees. These numbers represented a shift from typical patterns. Previous summers had shown more variable overnight cooling. The 1878 season was anomalous, and the interior conditions of frontier cabins reflected that anomaly. For the homesteader tracking his loft temperatures, the Signal Service data provided context. His discomfort was not isolated or imagined. It was part of a documented climatic event. The question became, could a cabin designed for winter cold be adapted for summer heat without compromising its cold season performance? The answer would not come from weather prediction. It would come from understanding how heat moved through a structure and how that movement could be controlled. The observation network did something else significant. It normalized the use of measurement in frontier decision-making. Temperature was no longer just a sensation. It was a number. Numbers could be compared, patterns identified, responses planned. When the homesteader later described his loft cooling method to neighbors, he did not appeal to comfort or preference. He cited temperatures. He compared before and after. He used the language of measurement that the Signal Service had made routine. Systematic observation changed how problems were understood and how solutions were evaluated. Homestead Loft, Denver outskirts, mid-July 1878. The loft was not intended as primary living space. It was additional square footage created by a pitched roof, cheap volume that required no additional foundation or wall construction. Homesteaders used lofts for storage, for sleeping overflow when families expanded, and for seasonal temperature management. In theory, heat stratification should have made lofts warmer in winter, a benefit. Hot air from the fireplace or stove rose naturally, making the loft the warmest part of the cabin when heating was needed. In summer, that same stratification became a liability. The homesteader's loft measured roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, with a ceiling peak of 6 feet at center, sloping to 4 feet at the eaves. Access was via a fixed ladder at one end. The floor was planked with split logs, gaps between them allowing some air exchange with the room below. 2 narrow bed frames occupied opposite corners. The loft had one advantage in summer: it was slightly removed from the cooking fire and the heat of human activity at ground level. That advantage disappeared when exterior heat exceeded interior heat. The loft became a reservoir for trapped warmth with no escape path. By mid-July, the boys who slept there reported consistent discomfort. The bedding absorbed moisture from their bodies, normal in any sleeping situation. But in the lofts, persistent heat, that moisture could not evaporate. Pillowcases felt damp by morning. Woolen blankets, necessary in cold months, became intolerable. Even cotton sheets retained warmth. The homesteader observed that the problem peaked during multi-day heat runs. A single hot day was survivable. The cabin's thermal mass would release some heat overnight. But 3 or 4 consecutive days with warm nights created cumulative heat loading. Each day added more stored energy than the night could remove. The behavioral response was predictable. Abandonment. The boys moved their bedding downstairs, sleeping near the door where slight air movement from cracks in the threshold provided marginal relief. The loft became storage-only space. This loss of livable area was not trivial. Frontier cabins were compact by necessity. Every square foot mattered. A loft that could not be occupied in summer represented a significant reduction in functional space during a season when families spent more time indoors due to heat, dust, and insects. The homesteader understood that structural modification was impractical. Cutting new windows or adding dedicated vent towers would require carpentry beyond his skill and materials beyond his budget. Any solution would need to work with what already existed and would need to preserve winter performance. The cabin did not need to be rebuilt. It needed to be operated differently. The distinction was critical. Homestead interior, July 23, 1878. Still air, flies collecting at the window frame. The simplest response to summer heat was to open windows. Most frontier cabins had at least one operable window, sometimes just an unglazed opening with a hinged shutter, sometimes a proper sash with real glass. The homesteader's cabin had a single south-facing window, 2 feet square, with 4 small panes of glass in a wooden frame. In theory, opening that window should have provided ventilation. In practice, it often made conditions worse. The problem was directional heat flow. When exterior air was cooler than interior air, an open window allowed warm inside air to escape and cooler outside air to enter. But during peak afternoon heat, when exterior temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, opening the window introduced hotter air into a space that, despite its discomfort, was still several degrees cooler than outside. The homesteader tested this on July 21st. At 2 in the afternoon, with the interior loft temperature estimated near 90 degrees, he opened the south window fully. Within 20 minutes, the loft felt warmer, not cooler. The entering air carried heat and dust. Insects followed. Cross-ventilation required 2 openings on opposite walls or at different heights to create pressure differential. The cabin had only 1 window. The door, when opened, provided a second opening, but both door and window faced generally southward. No meaningful cross-flow developed. Ventilation also required air movement outside the cabin. On still days, which were common during high-pressure heat events, exterior air did not move. Opening windows simply connected 2 stagnant air masses at different temperatures. The hotter mass, outside, warmed the cooler mass, inside, until equilibrium was reached. There were secondary problems. Dust was pervasive on the high plains. An open window admitted fine soil particles that settled on surfaces, contaminated food, and aggravated respiratory discomfort. Period health notices from Denver warned of dust-related respiratory complaints during dry summer months. Security was another consideration. An open window or door at night invited intrusion, animal or human. Frontier cabins were isolated. Leaving openings unsecured was imprudent. The homesteader concluded that windows alone could not solve the loft heat problem. What was needed was not more openings, but a specific kind of opening, one that allowed hot air to exit, without requiring cooler air to be available for entry. The exhaust had to be driven by something other than wind or temperature difference between exterior and interior. The cabin needed a heat-powered exhaust that worked even when outside air was hotter than inside air. That mechanism existed, but it was idle in summer, designed only for smoke removal during winter heating. The stovepipe sat unused from May through September. Black iron, exposed to sun, warming without purpose. It was already a chimney. It just was not being used as one. Loft ceiling penetration, July 24, 1878. A chimney is a device for creating vertical airflow. Fire is the common driver. Combustion heats air, which expands and rises, drawing cooler air in from below. But fire is not the only heat source. Any warming of the air column inside a vertical pipe will create draft, provided the temperature difference between the column and surrounding air is sufficient. This principle was understood in industrial applications. Drying kilns and ventilation shafts used solar-heated chimneys to create airflow without fuel cost. The technique was described in technical manuals for factories and grain storage facilities. It was rarely applied to domestic structures. The homesteader's cabin had a stovepipe that ran vertically from the ground floor heating stove through the loft and out the roof via a metal collar. The pipe was 6 inches in diameter, made of sectional iron pieces fitted together. In winter, it carried smoke from the stove. In summer, it sat idle, still connected to the stove below, but sealed at the stove's damper to prevent downdrafts. The key feature was the pipe's surface. Years of winter use had coated it with soot, carbon deposits from incomplete combustion. Soot is black. Black surfaces absorb solar radiation efficiently, converting light energy to heat. A soot-blackened pipe exposed to direct sun will warm significantly above ambient air. Temperature. The portion of the pipe passing through the loft was enclosed by the structure, but the section above the roof was fully exposed. On a clear summer day with intense sun, that exposed section absorbed heat continuously from dawn until evening. The iron conducted that heat downward into the pipe column. The homesteader tested the pipe's temperature on July 24th at mid-afternoon. The exposed section was too hot to touch. The section inside the loft, though shaded from direct sun, was noticeably warm. The question was whether that warmth was sufficient to create draft. The answer depended on the temperature difference between the air inside the pipe and the surrounding air. Even a small difference, 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, would produce measurable upward flow in a 6-foot vertical column. The homesteader devised a simple test. He lit a small twist of hay and held it near the top of the pipe, where it passed through the loft ceiling. The smoke moved upward, into the pipe, drawn by the draft. The movement was gentle but definite. The pipe was already creating draft, just not removing any loft heat. The rising air inside the pipe was coming from the stove below, flowing through gaps in the damper mechanism. That air was exhausting to outside, but it was ground floor air, not loft air. The loft's hot air was separated from the pipe by planking and the pipe's own outer surface. To make the pipe useful, loft air needed direct access to the draft. The pipe was working. It was simply working on the wrong air. Technical reconstruction, late July 1878. The stovepipe installation in frontier cabins followed a standard pattern. The heating stove sat on the ground floor, usually near the center of the single room, to maximize heat distribution. The pipe extended vertically upward to minimize horizontal runs, which reduced draft efficiency and increased creosote buildup. In cabins with lofts, the pipe necessarily passed through. The loft floor continued upward through the loft space and exited via a roof penetration. This created a tall, straight column, ideal for draft generation. The taller the column, the stronger the potential draft, because the temperature-driven pressure difference accumulated over greater vertical distance. Period stove catalogs and installation manuals illustrated these configurations. A typical diagram showed the stove, the vertical pipe run, the thimble, a protective metal collar where the pipe passed through the floor, and the roof jack that sealed the roof penetration against weather. The Homesteader's installation matched this standard pattern exactly. His pipe extended approximately 8 feet from stove to roof peak, 6 feet from ground floor to loft ceiling, then another 2 feet through the loft space and out the roof. What the installation manuals did not address was summer operation. The guidance assumed the stove would be unused in warm months, with the pipe serving no function until cold weather returned. The damper at the stove would be closed to prevent downdrafts and animal entry. The system would be dormant. But dormant did not mean non-functional. The physical structure remained. The height remained. The solar exposure remained. The only missing element was the connection between the loft's hot air and the pipe's draft. The Homesteader recognized that the solution was not to build something new, but to open a pathway within what already existed. The pipe was already pulling air upward, air from below, through damper gaps and stove joints. If loft air could reach the pipe, it would be pulled upward the same way. The existing floor planking around the pipe was tight, installed to prevent heat loss from the loft down to the ground floor in winter. That seal, useful in January, was counterproductive in July. It prevented exactly the air exchange that would cool the loft. The modification required was modest. Cut an opening in the loft floor, directly beneath the pipe penetration point. This opening would allow loft air to access the pipe's draft. The rising air inside the pipe would draw loft air into the column, exhausting it to the exterior. The concept was simple. The execution required care. The opening had to be large enough to provide adequate airflow, but not so large as to compromise the floor's structural integrity or create a falling hazard. It needed to be positioned precisely beneath the pipe to capture the draft effectively. And it needed to be closable for winter, when the seal would again be necessary. The required tools were basic: a saw, a chisel, some skill. The work could be completed in an afternoon. Loft floor beneath stovepipe penetration, July the 26th, 1878. The Homesteader marked a square on the loft floor directly beneath the point where the stovepipe passed through to the roof. The dimensions were approximately 10 inches by 12 inches, large enough to provide meaningful airflow, small enough to be spanned safely. He used a handsaw to cut along the marked lines, working carefully to avoid splintering the planks. The floor was made of split logs, hewn flat on one side, with the flat side facing up. The wood was pine, approximately 2 inches thick. The sawing took an hour. Once the rectangular opening was cut, he smoothed the edges with a chisel and plane. Rough edges would splinter over time or catch clothing. The opening revealed the space beneath, the gap between the loft floor and the ground floor ceiling, where the stovepipe rose vertically through. The next step was to make the opening safer. A 10 by 12-inch hole in the floor could cause injury. The Homesteader constructed a simple grille from scrap lumber. He cut thin slats, approximately 1 inch wide and 3/4 of an inch thick, and spaced them 1 inch apart across the opening. The slats ran parallel to the pipe, allowing air to pass between them while preventing anyone from stepping into the hole. The slats were secured by nailing them to a frame that sat flush with the floor surface. The entire assembly could be lifted out if necessary, for cleaning, for winter sealing, or for access to the pipe below. The completed grille weighed perhaps 2 pounds. The total material cost was negligible. Scrap wood already on hand, a dozen nails. The labor investment was roughly 3 hours, 1 hour marking and cutting, 1 hour smoothing and fitting, 1 hour constructing and installing the grille. When the work was finished, the Homesteader knelt beside the opening and felt for airflow. Warm air from the loft was moving downward through the slats toward the pipe column below. The draft created by the sun-warmed pipe was pulling loft air into its upward flow. The effect was not dramatic. There was no rush of wind, no immediate temperature drop, but the air was moving. Heat was leaving the loft via a controlled pathway rather than simply accumulating with nowhere to go. The modification had created a directed exhaust. The loft's hottest air, concentrated at the highest point, now had direct access to the vertical draft generated by the sun-heated stovepipe. The system was no longer passive. It was operating. The question remaining was whether this modest airflow would be sufficient to change the loft's livability. The test would come over the following week, as daytime highs remained above 90 degrees and nighttime lows stayed in the 60s. If the exhaust worked, the cumulative heat loading should decrease. If it failed, the loft would remain unusable. The homesteader recorded in his ledger, "Grille cut and fitted, air drawing upward, will measure effect after 3 days continuous operation. Cabin interior, ground floor, July 27th through 31st, 1878. Removing hot air from the loft created a pressure imbalance. Air was leaving via the stovepipe exhaust, but air does not simply disappear. The volume had to be replaced. The question was, where would the replacement air come from? Without a defined inlet, the replacement air would come from wherever leakage existed. Cracks around the door, gaps in the chinking, the same spaces that winter construction tried to eliminate. This random inflow was inefficient. It drew air from all directions, without preference for cooler sources. The homesteader recognized that controlling the inlet was as important as creating the exhaust. He wanted replacement air to come from the coolest available source. On a homestead in open prairie, that meant shaded locations, specifically the north side of the cabin, which received no direct sun during summer afternoons. The cabin had no north-facing window. The single window was on the south wall. But the door was on the east wall, and the cabin's north wall, though solid, had small gaps at the base where the lowest logs met the stone foundation. These gaps had been deliberately left, unsealed during construction to allow drainage if water entered the cabin. They were small, perhaps a quarter-inch total width, but they provided a path for air entry. The homesteader tested the airflow pattern by observing smoke from a hay twist. On the afternoon of July 27th, with the grill open and the sun warming the stovepipe, he lit the twist and moved it around the ground floor. Near the south window, the smoke hung still or drifted slightly inward. No useful flow. Near the door, the smoke showed slight movement toward the interior. Near the base of the north wall, the smoke moved definitively inward, drawn by the pressure drop created by the exhaust above. This confirmed that a convection loop was forming. Hot loft air exiting via the stovepipe, cooler ground floor air entering via north wall gaps, and air from the ground floor rising to replace the loft air being exhausted. The homesteader enhanced the inlet by deliberately leaving the east door open a few inches during peak heat hours. This increased the replacement airflow without compromising security. The door could be watched or closed quickly if needed. The door opening was positioned to draw air that had been shaded by the cabin's own structure during afternoon hours. The complete system now functioned as a passive cooling loop. Solar energy heated the stovepipe, creating draft. Draft pulled loft air upward. Loft air was replaced by ground floor air. Ground floor air was replaced by exterior air entering through shaded openings. The exterior air, though warm, was typically cooler than the loft air being exhausted, resulting in net heat removal. The system operated continuously as long as the sun heated the pipe. It required no fuel, no mechanical action, no attention beyond opening the door and ensuring the grill remained uncovered. It was thermally powered ventilation using existing structure and free energy. The physics were straightforward. The implementation was modest. The question was whether the effect would be measurable. Denver region, August 8, 1878, 105 degrees Fahrenheit at 2 in the afternoon. The signal service recorded the temperature at 2:28 in the afternoon, 105 degrees Fahrenheit. It matched the all-time high for Denver, a record that had stood since the station's establishment. The overnight low had been 71 degrees. The wind was calm. The sky was clear. Solar radiation was intense. This was the condition the system was designed for, not typical summer heat, but extreme heat combined with warm nights. If the sun pipe cooling method worked, it would work now. If it failed, the failure would be obvious. The homesteader checked the loft at mid-morning before peak heat. The space was warm but tolerable. The boys had slept there the previous night without relocating downstairs. The bedding showed less moisture than it had in mid-July before the grill installation. By noon, exterior temperature had passed 95 degrees. The loft temperature was rising, but the rate of increase was slower than it had been during the July heat events. The homesteader felt air movement near the floor grill, warm air flowing toward the stovepipe, drawn by the draft. At 2 in the afternoon, the exterior temperature peaked. The homesteader climbed into the loft. The space was uncomfortable. There was no escaping the fact that air above 90 degrees feels hot regardless of movement. But it was not unbearable. More significantly, the heat was not accumulating the way it had before the modification. The air was moving. The exhaust was functioning. He tested the stovepipe section in the loft. It was warm but not scalding. The draft was removing heat before it could fully transfer to the loft air. He checked the grill. Airflow remained steady, pulling loft air downward toward the pipe opening. The critical test came that evening. As exterior temperatures dropped into the 80s after sunset, the loft cooled noticeably. By 10 at night, with exterior air near 75 degrees, the loft temperature had fallen to the low 80s, still warm but no longer trapped in the mid-90s as it had been during previous heat events. The boys slept in the loft that night. The bedding remained dry. The next morning, the homesteader recorded in his ledger, "Loft usable through peak heat, exhaust system held, no more sweat on pillows." The phrasing was precise. The success metric was not achieving coolness. That was impossible without refrigeration or massive airflow. The metric was maintaining usability. The loft remained functional sleeping space during conditions that would have made it uninhabitable without the modification. The test had validated the concept. A sun-heated stovepipe, combined with a floor grill and controlled inlet, created sufficient airflow to prevent heat accumulation in a loft space. The effect was not dramatic, but it was sufficient. In frontier terms, sufficient meant survival. It meant not abandoning living space. It meant not relocating families. It meant making use of structure that had already been built and paid for. The method worked. The question now was whether it could be explained and transferred to others facing similar conditions. Loft floor grill, August 9th through 12th, 1878. A frontier solution had to meet two standards. It must work when needed, and it must not compromise other functions. The sun pipe cooling system met the first standard. The August heat test proved it could remove loft heat during extreme conditions. But the second standard required examination. The modification had cut an opening in the loft floor, an opening that connected the loft space to the stovepipe column. In summer, this connection enabled cooling. In winter, it would enable heat loss. Warm air from the ground floor stove would rise through the grill into the loft rather than heating the living space below. The very feature that made summer cooling possible would make winter heating inefficient. The homesteader addressed this by making the grill removable. The slatted cover lifted out completely, leaving the opening accessible. A solid board, cut to the same dimensions as the grill frame, could be placed over the opening and sealed with clay or fabric to prevent air leakage during winter months. This meant the modification was reversible on a seasonal basis. Summer operation, grill open, creating exhaust path. Winter operation, opening sealed, preserving heated air in living space. The system adapted to the season by changing configuration, not by permanent alteration. There was a secondary control, the stove damper. During summer, the damper remained fully closed, preventing any downdraft from the pipe and ensuring that the only air moving through the system was loft air drawn by solar draft. During winter, the damper opened for normal stove operation, and the grill opening was sealed to prevent warm air loss. The homesteader tested the reversibility on August 12th. He placed the solid coverboard over the grill opening and sealed the edges with rags. The airflow stopped immediately. The loft began warming within an hour, confirming that sealing the opening eliminated the cooling effect. He removed the cover, and cooling resumed. This demonstrated that the system imposed no permanent penalty on winter performance. The structure could be returned to its original configuration each fall. The only lasting change was the cut opening in the floor, and that opening was small enough that covering it restored full function. There was one additional safety consideration: fire risk. The stovepipe passed through the grill area. If the stove were operated with the grill open, hot pipe surfaces would be exposed. The homesteader marked this clearly in his notes. Grill must be covered and sealed before first winter fire. Exposed pipe, pulse open grill, pause burn risk and heat loss. The control protocol was straightforward. Spring, remove cover, open grill, allow summer cooling. Fall, replace cover, seal edges, resume winter heating. The transition took less than an hour twice per year. A method that required constant attention or created permanent trade-offs would not spread. Frontier households operated on narrow margins. Any technique that added labor or reduced efficiency in one season to benefit another would be abandoned. The sun pipe system avoided that trap by being fully reversible. It borrowed summer function from winter hardware without compromising winter performance. The system was not automatic, but it was simple, and simplicity was the requirement for adoption. Loft sleeping space, mid-August 1878. The homesteader did not measure temperature precisely. He had no thermometer. The signal service station recorded exterior conditions, but interior temperatures went unrecorded. What the homesteader could measure was behavior and physical evidence. The clearest evidence was bedding condition. Before the grill installation, during the warm nights of mid-July, the boys' pillowcases showed moisture each morning. The dampness came from perspiration and exhaled moisture trapped in fabric that could not dry in the persistently warm loft air. The effect was cumulative. Each night added moisture that the following day's heat could not fully evaporate. After the grill installation and through the peak heat of early August, the pillowcases remained dry. Morning inspection showed no dampness. The bedding felt dry to the touch. The woolen blankets, stored during peak heat, could be used again on cooler nights without retaining uncomfortable warmth. This change indicated that the loft air was no longer saturated with heat and humidity. The exhaust system was removing warm, moisture-laden air continuously during daylight hours, replacing it with drier air from below. Even though replacement air was also warm, it was less saturated because it came from a larger volume and had not been trapped in the loft's confined space overnight. The second measurable outcome was sleeping location. The boys moved their bedding back to the loft in early August and remained there through the remainder of the summer. This represented a reversal of behavior. People do not choose to sleep in uncomfortable spaces when alternatives exist. The fact that loft sleeping resumed indicated that the space had become tolerable. The homesteader recorded this in his ledger with a single line: "Boys upstairs again. No complaints. Bedding dry." The phrasing reflected frontier documentation practice: brief, factual, focused on observable outcomes. There was no elaboration about comfort or temperature sensation. The facts were: sleeping location changed, bedding condition improved, complaints ceased. These were measurable indicators that the modification had achieved its purpose. There was a third indicator, though less tangible. The loft returned to its intended function as usable living space. During the peak of July heat, the loft had been abandoned except for storage. The boys spent evenings and sleeping hours on the ground floor, creating crowding and reducing household efficiency. By mid-August, the loft was again occupied. The boys used the space for sleeping, reading, and evening activities. The cabin's full square footage was functional. This mattered economically. The loft represented approximately one-third of the cabin's total floor area. Its abandonment during summer effectively reduced the cabin's size by one-third. Its restoration added that capacity back without any additional construction cost. The method's success was defined not by achieving coolness, but by maintaining function. The loft was not cold. It was rarely even comfortable by modern standards. But it was usable. In frontier terms, usable was the threshold that mattered. Usable meant the structure delivered the capacity it was built to provide. Usable meant the investment in construction yielded its intended return across all seasons, not just one. The outcome was measured in dry fabric and changed behavior, small indicators that represented significant improvement in daily living conditions during extreme heat. Comparative Frontier Cabins, South Platte region, late 1870s. The sun pipe cooling method spread through informal observation and conversation. The homesteader did not publicize his modification, but neighbors noticed that his loft remained occupied during the August heat while theirs were abandoned. Questions led to explanations. Explanations led to replications. But the method did not work equally well in all cabins. Its effectiveness depended on specific structural conditions that not all frontier buildings possessed. Understanding where the method worked and where it failed reveals the limits of any frontier technique. The method required vertical height. The stovepipe needed to extend from ground level through the loft and above the roof peak. The taller the column, the stronger the potential draft. Cabins with low-pitched roofs or no lofts could not generate sufficient draft to create meaningful airflow. The physics required vertical distance and temperature difference. Without height, even a sun-heated pipe produced minimal draft. The method required solar exposure. The stovepipe section above the roof had to receive direct sunlight for most of the day. Cabins situated in heavy timber on north-facing slopes or under dense shade did not receive sufficient solar heating to warm the pipe adequately. A shaded pipe generated little draft. Some homesteaders responded by painting exposed pipe sections black to increase absorption, but this helped only marginally if solar exposure was already limited. The method required a controllable inlet. Air leaving through the exhaust had to be replaced by air entering from a definable location, preferably a shaded cooler source. Cabins with random leakage but no manageable inlet points could not direct replacement airflow effectively. The result was unpredictable drafts and minimal cooling benefit. The method required loft volume. Cabins without lofts or with very low ceiling spaces had insufficient air volume to benefit from exhaust ventilation. The technique was designed to remove heat from an upper air reservoir. If no reservoir existed, there was nothing to remove. Where these conditions aligned, vertical pipe run, solar exposure, controlled inlet, loft volume, the method worked reliably. Homesteaders in the South Platte Basin, where cabins typically had pitched roofs and lofts for sleeping, saw consistent success. The technique spread through that community quickly. Where conditions did not align, the method failed or provided negligible benefit. Cabins with flat sod roofs, common in treeless prairie regions, had minimal vertical pipe runs and little solar exposure on the pipe. The technique provided no advantage. Similarly, cabins in dense timber or narrow valleys with limited sun exposure saw little improvement. This selectivity meant the method diffused unevenly across frontier regions. It became standard practice in some communities and remained unknown in others. There was no formal documentation, no published guide. Transfer happened through direct observation and word-of-mouth explanation between neighbors facing similar conditions. The pattern reflected a broader truth about frontier innovation. Techniques spread not by universal promotion, but by fit, a method adopted where conditions allowed success. It was ignored or abandoned where conditions prevented function. The sun pipe cooling system belonged to a specific set of cabin types in specific climates. Within that range, it was valuable. Outside that range, it was irrelevant. Frontier methods were context-dependent. Their spread followed environmental logic, not promotional effort. Denver, Colorado, summer 1878 and beyond. The significance of the sun pipe chimney method was not its novelty. Passive ventilation had been used in various forms for centuries. Solar chimneys existed in industrial and agricultural applications. The principles of convection were well understood by engineers and builders with formal training. What made the Homesteader's modification significant was its context. A frontier cabin built with minimal resources, adapted using existing materials and basic tools to solve a seasonal problem without compromising year-round function. It represented practical problem-solving within severe constraints, the essence of frontier craft. The method did not spread widely in the historical record because it was specific to a narrow set of conditions. But within those conditions, it was effective. Homesteaders who adopted the technique reported similar outcomes. Loft spaces remained usable during heat events that previously rendered them uninhabitable. The modification required minimal investment, a few hours of carpentry, no purchased materials, and imposed no penalty on winter performance. The broader lesson was about infrastructure reuse. Frontier builders often solved problems not by building new systems, but by finding alternate uses for existing components. The stovepipe existed for winter smoke exhaust. In summer, it became a heat exhaust. The same physical structure served different functions in different seasons. This dual-purpose thinking reflected resource scarcity and practical ingenuity. The Signal Service temperature log for August 8, 1878, recorded 105 degrees Fahrenheit at 2:28 in the afternoon. That number represented an extreme, tied for the highest temperature in Denver's recorded history at that time. It was not typical summer weather. It was a stress test. The fact that a simple floor grill and controlled airflow allowed a loft to remain functional during that extreme validated the method's utility. Frontier life required preparing for the worst case, not the average case. A cabin that failed during extreme heat or extreme cold could not be relied upon. A modification that improved comfort in average conditions but collapsed in extremes was worthless. The sun pipe method met the frontier standard. It worked when it mattered most. During the hottest days of a record-setting summer, the loft stayed usable. Bedding remained dry. Sleeping continued in the intended space. The homesteader's ledger recorded temperatures, dates, and outcomes with the precision available to him. He noted wind conditions, cloud cover, time of day. His documentation lacked scientific instruments, but it captured the essential facts. Before the modification, the loft was abandoned during heat events. After the modification, it remained occupied. The change was measurable in behavior and physical evidence. The final assessment was quiet and factual. The method had solved a specific problem for a specific cabin type in a specific climate. It had done so without requiring resources the homesteader did not possess. It had maintained winter function while adding summer capability. It had survived the test of extreme conditions. In a summer that reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit, a loft remained livable, not because walls were thicker, but because air was finally allowed to leave.